Hi, everyone, and welcome to Tell Me About Podcast, where each week two nerdy friends deep dive random topics. I'm Laura.
And I'm a very refreshed Tom.
And this is episode number 25.
Before we get started, we hope you enjoyed last week's episode. We are going to have a couple of announcements coming up, one of which we can actually share with you today. We're going to be doing something, and this is going to be kind of a recurring thing, but we are going to be starting something here on the podcast called the Film Festival. We've done a couple of film review episodes already. We did the dinner party episode of The Office. We did Office Space. So this is going to be something, and we're going to start this in a couple of weeks, into March. The goal is to try and introduce the other co-hosts to movies they have not seen yet, or movies that we've both seen. We won't spoil what the first one's going to be, but I think when it comes out at the end of March, early April, you're going to really love it.
It's an absolute abomination that Tom has not seen this movie.
What is it? Is it Citizen Kane? Is it Get Me to the Greek? You'll have to wait and see and find out. We are going to have some schedule-related announcements for April and May, but we are going to announce that later on, probably in the next couple of weeks. And we will let you know when that happens. Just keep an eye out for that. But we are really excited to debut the film festival. I mean, we're hoping this is going to be right up there with like Sundance and TIFF and Tribeca. The Tell Me About Film Festival is going to be easily the top 4 of that group.
You're really confident about this.
Well, I think we're starting off with a banger.
We are. That's true.
Now, granted, there could be nowhere to put down to go from that, but we'll see. So for today, for episode 25, we are diving into yet another minefield. You know, we on this podcast do not shy away from the tough topics, from things that will cause debate. We are getting into the Cola Wars. Choose a side. I mean, did you have a preference?
Yeah, I would prefer Coke because I just don't like the way Pepsi tastes. No, but like I don't drink it enough to care. So it's not like I have strong emotions about this, but
Well, I mean, that's thankfully you have me, where I think 35% of my blood at this point is either a Coke, Sprite, and Dr. Pepper proprietary blend. And none of that Mr. Pibb shit. Mr. Pibb is an inferior. If Mr. Pibb was that good, he'd have credentials at the end of his name. Dr. Pepper is a literal doctor.
Yikes.
I kind of want to start this by just going briefly into the Cola Wars, but also really kind of framing this around something that happened in the mid-90s. And I actually don't remember this happening, but apparently it was a big deal. And it wasn't until I did my research that I actually realized how big of a deal it was. And we'll get to that in a second. Cola Wars really kind of start, you have to go back to the beginning. Coke is the first one that's founded. And that's the secret recipe, it's the trade secret of trade secrets. I don't know how secret it is. It's caramel water.
Is it true that Coke had cocaine in it initially?
It did.
Okay, that's what I thought.
But it was supposed to be medicinal. Pepsi's actually created by a pharmacist about 20 years after Coke is.
What? Is that not weird?
I mean, I go back to the Lewis Black line that we've all drank enough Coke and Pepsi that we could piss it for a week. These were supposed to be medicines. These were marketed when they first came on the market. These were marketed as like cure-alls. I mean, these were meant to be medicine, which is really, really weird if you think about it. First part of the 20th century, Coke really takes off. In fact, Pepsi actually almost declares bankruptcy twice, famously, during the first half of the 20th century. There's also even a time in the 60s where Coke almost buys Pepsi, which would have been really effing weird.
Can you imagine that? Like this, what you're about to go into would have never happened.
No. And what happens is Coke becomes extremely popular. They not only trademark the secret formula, but they also trademark the famous glass bottle, the contour bottle. And Pepsi is desperately trying to compete. And as we get to like the 70s and the 80s, the only way Pepsi can really compete is with advertising.
Do you know how Pepsi was originally packaged and distributed?
It was glass bottles as well, but not the Coke hourglass bottle. Again, that's a Coke trademark. So Pepsi is trying to push itself and push Coke. They get some breaks. In the 80s, Coke basically experiments with one of the great disasters of the of the 80s, New Coke. It's so bad, it's so reviled that they basically have to go back. They also create Coke 2, eschewing other names such as Coke 2 Electric Boogaloo and 2 Coke 2 Furious. So Pepsi has an opportunity, and it's during this time where Pepsi really pushes the envelope with their advertising. And their advertising is really where they get an advantage on Coke. Coke had iconic advertising. They had, the famous have a Coke and a smile. They had, the famous commercial with the kid gives Mean Joe Green the Coke in the in the tunnel underneath the football field, and Mean Joe Green tosses him his football jersey.
That was so iconic. Yeah.
It was. And when you think of Coke, that's what you think of. And then later on, you think of the polar bears.
I will say I did have a Coca-Cola polar bear growing up, and it was the cutest thing.
I think it was a Coca-Cola polar bear ornament. Hallmark used to make all the branded ornaments. Like I had a Pizza Hut ornament. I had a Wheaties ornament. My Christmas tree was like basically just a shrine to 90s capitalism. But where Pepsi is able to really shine is they have this distinct advertising, and they're able to recruit big, hip celebrities. So if you remember in the 80s, they had Ray Charles doing the Diet Pepsi commercial with the piano and the tuxedo.
I do remember that.
They have the famous Super Bowl commercial with Cindy Crawford getting a Pepsi. The one I remember is the rivalry between the Coke delivery driver and the Pepsi delivery driver. And the Coke driver tries to get a Pepsi and all the cans fall down in front of him. And we'll put some of this up on our social as well. But Pepsi was able to come up with these clever slogans. They, the Pepsi generation, Pepsi was supposed to be the youthful drink. That if you were young and hip, you drank Pepsi. They had Shaquille O'Neal. They had Michael Jackson did Pepsi commercials. Coke didn't really have celebrities doing their commercials. Like Pepsi usually had a Super Bowl ad. Usually Pepsi and Budweiser were usually the biggest Super Bowl advertisers at the time, especially in the early 90s. They had the same ad agency as well that had worked on all of their campaigns for years with the same executives. And so in 1995, they are trying to come up with a way to get people to buy Pepsi. What they come up with is something akin to, and this is going to be a reference for a very specific crowd. Do you remember when you used to be able to market and promote cigarettes, and they used to have the thing that said if you had so many boxes of cigarettes, you can trade them in for like a jean jacket?
Maybe. Was it a Marlboro thing?
Yep.
I remember
And
that.
I think Camel did it too. Basically, if you drank enough Pepsi, you can collect points. And you can turn these points into things like glasses and jackets and t-shirts and things. So they decide to launch this with a commercial. And they're trying to find a funny, kind of hip way to market this free stuff. I mean, not free. You have to drink a shitload of Pepsi to get it. And so the designer basically comes up with an idea, something akin, I think they related it to actually A Clockwork Orange, and that basically with the typing. So, Laura, I have put a video in your chat. Go ahead and watch it.
All right, here we go.
Introducing the new Pepsi Stuff Catalog. Pepsi you drink, the more great stuff you're going to get.
Sure beats the bus.
Well, yikes. That's a lot of points to get a jet.
Yes, it is. And if you notice, there's no kind of disclaimer saying that you can't get the jet.
I think I know where this is going.
Mm-hmm. As the story goes, in the 4-part Netflix documentary that came out about this, the incident that I'm going to describe, the original story that the ad agency had drawn up had not as central casting, I guess would be the best way to describe it. Looking kid wearing all of this Pepsi stuff and then flying into school in a Harrier jet. Allegedly, or at least according to the ad executive, the Harrier jet was supposed to be for 700 million Pepsi points, which would make it very clear that it was a joke. But it was Pepsi executives who made the commercial look more like Tom Cruise in Top Gun, and also had it read only 7 million Pepsi points to make it look better on TV. You have to remember, back in 1995, there were no such things as flat screens. We're all just watching, tubes, and they were concerned about what the spacing, how it looked. But you notice there's also not a disclaimer on there, or anything that would make it seem like it's a joke. Well, enter a gentleman named John Leonard. He is a 20-year-old kid who's going to community college in Seattle, Washington, and he's doing a lot of odd jobs. While he's a mountain guide in Alaska, where he meets an entrepreneur named Todd Hoffman. Him and Hoffman become very good friends. It's after they become good friends that John sees this commercial and sees that there's nothing saying that the Harrier jet is a joke. So he starts dreaming up ways to get the Harrier jet. Accumulate enough Pepsi points to get the Harrier jet.
Challenge accepted.
And so he comes up with a business plan to store this Pepsi in like 6 different warehouses across the country. He surmises that he needs about, I think it was like $24 million worth of Pepsi. It was like millions upon millions of cans of Pepsi, these 12-pack cans of Pepsi, that they were then going to like resell after they cut out the codes.
They had to spend $24 million on Pepsi. What codes were they cutting out? Oh, on the label? Was it on the label?
So basically how it worked was you would have to collect these Pepsi points, and they were either inside the label on the bottle, or they were inside the cardboard of the 12 packs.
Okay.
They're scheming up this idea, and they can't get around what to do with the Pepsi. Like that's the one thing they can't get around is what are they going to do with all this friggin' Pepsi once they buy it? And so John, as the story goes, thinks the dream is dead until he sees a catalog in a convenience store for this Pepsi stuff. And in the catalog at the back, it says, as long as you have, I think it was like 15 Pepsi points, you could buy however many Pepsi points you needed for 10 cents a point. As long as you bought some Pepsi, you can then, if you wanted something in the catalog, you can then just buy the, like airline miles. I think it was 10 cents a point. So they calculated they would only really then need $700,000 under this plan to come up with the points.
Only $700,000.
So they get the order form, and there's all kinds of boxes for the shirt, the glasses, everything. They write in their own box for Harrier Jet and send in a check for $700,000 to Pepsi with Mr. Hoffman paying this.
Mr. Hoffman had some money.
He's portrayed in a Netflix documentary as very successful. They also go into the fact that, they had like a business plan that they were going to use this jet as like for like air shows and things like that. They were going to make a business out of this jet.
I have a question, though. It might be a stupid question, but like if he had so much money, couldn't he just buy his own jet?
Well, and here's the thing. One of the central themes that's going to come up in this is, can a civilian actually own a Harrier jet? A Harrier jet is a military vehicle.
Okay, I did not know that.
and it is actually up for debate. John actually calls the Pentagon because that was a thing you could do in 1995. In 2024, that would probably get you arrested. But in 1995, you could basically get a spokesperson who would tell you if, as long as the armaments are not on the jet, yes, a civilian could own a Harrier jet, as long as it doesn't have the missiles attached to it. So they send in this check for $700,000 and an order form for one Harrier jet. Eventually, Pepsi finds out about it. They somewhat dismiss it by just not cashing the check and sending him a voucher for one free Pepsi.
That's a big difference than a Harrier jet.
That is. And so the two of them decide to pursue it. And they basically go back and forth. They get an attorney, and they push Pepsi to give them a jet.
I have a question.
Yes.
Would you have taken this case?
Probably not.
Because it's so ridiculous?
Not that it's ridiculous, but I just don't know. There would have been a lot of variables you would have had to get over. Well, you'll know one of the lawyers who ends up taking the case, though.
Is it an OJ lawyer?
No, but it's an infamous one. Eventually, after some letters back and forth, Pepsi meets with John and his counsel in New York and offers him up to $1 million instead of going for the jet. This was basically to make him go away. John, at this point, is fighting on principle. He turns down the money because he wants the jet. Where's my Harrier jet?
They have a business plan.
They have a business plan. Where's my Harrier jet? So at that point, Pepsi sues John. John countersues Pepsi. John argues that Pepsi, in effect, breached a contract. That by putting the jet in the ad, not putting a disclaimer that it was a joke, making it in a somewhat obtainable goal of points, that it constituted an offer.
I love that you said somewhat attainable.
That's the whole basis of their argument.
No, I get it. Yes.
Yeah. Because of that, it was an offer. And that by sending in for the $700,000 check for the Pepsi points constituted acceptance of an offer. Every law student who's listening to this now is their eyes starting to twitch because this is first year contracts. What's an offer? What's a contract? I've been a lawyer for almost 10 years. I still can't figure that the fuck out. I still have no idea of what's an offer and what's a contract or what constitutes an offer. His original lawyer was I think it was like a property attorney, a property acquisition attorney. So he reaches out to a friend who gets him a young lawyer who is well-versed or supposedly well-versed in, public relations and things like that and can really control a public message. You didn't know the lawyer then, you probably know him now. Michael Avenatti.
Oh, yikes.
In fact, so yikes that when they interviewed him for the Netflix documentary, they did it from his house while he was on house arrest for trying to extort Nike.
Feels right.
One of the things is when you watch him in the documentary, you can kind of see why that happened. So he gets involved in the case, and John basically becomes, over the next couple of years, a media darling. He's going on all these talk shows. He is being interviewed by the Today Show, by CBS This Morning, talking about this lawsuit that's now become very public. It's getting eaten up by the news cycle. Avenatti comes into this. He was big in the political field. He had done a lot of opposition research. That's what he claims. Being big in the political field, being big in PR, and knowing how to work the media, which he does. He very much likes being in front of a microphone.
Well, we definitely saw that when he was in the media spotlight most recently. He certainly knows how to work the cameras. Absolutely.
Now, one thing that's very clear during the Netflix documentary is that Hoffman and Avenatti do not get along at all. And that's really a point of contention because Hoffman is the one funding all of this. So when Avenatti wants to get really aggressive and really go on the offensive, Hoffman kind of pushes back. And so one of the things that Avenatti basically wants to do is he wants to publicize a promotion that Pepsi does in the Philippines in the early 90s, where they had a contest where they would print codes on the insides of bottle caps, and then they would do a national drawing on live television. If you won your code, if the number was called, you won 1 million, I think it was Philippine pesos, which was, I think, like at the time, $45,000. And for a lot of people in the Philippines, that's a lifeline. You're kind of holding your hopes on winning that money. It was a draw for Pepsi because the Philippines were a very Coca-Cola dominated market. Like, I think they interviewed a journalist from the Philippines who said that I think they had a 75% market share in the Philippines at that point in the early 90s. I mean, the interviews in this Netflix documentary they interview everyone from Cindy Crawford to now Philippine Senator Manny Pacquiao, the former boxing champion. But they also interview residents of the Philippines who were kind of really betting everything that they were going to win this money and it was going to change their lives. So they announced the winning number, and about 12 or 15 different people have the same number. And what ends up happening is Pepsi claims it was a misprint. So none of these people won, and they all got, like, I think it was like $20 instead. And it actually causes a big uprising in the Philippines to the point where there's protests outside Pepsi bottling plants. People are throwing Molotov cocktails at Pepsi trucks. One person actually dies by being hit with a Molotov cocktail, and they actually interview, I think it was the woman's daughter, who basically says to her translator, if it wasn't for this promotion, my mother would be alive today.
That's so sad.
It gets to a point where the Philippine government brings fraud charges against Pepsi. There was investigations, there were rumors that Pepsi had basically firebombed their own trucks to make it look like Philippine citizens had done it in an act of violence. But it was a real black eye for Pepsi in the Philippines. As the documentary goes, Avenatti was basically going to use this to put public pressure on Pepsi to get the jet. And he actually had ads that were going to run in papers showing a Pepsi bottle as a Molotov cocktail, to bring publicity to this. It's portrayed as kind of a real back and forth between Hoffman and between Avenatti. Hoffman really doesn't want to go down this road, and he basically comes right out and says in the documentary, isn't this the same shit that basically landed him in prison, meaning Avenatti? And eventually John decides he's not going to pursue this. So they get another lawyer, and eventually the case goes to trial in the Southern District of New York. So the case goes before a very pro-corporate judge in New York. And what I can tell you is a lot of times cases will be won or lost purely on the judge you draw. The judge was kind of portrayed as very pro-corporate, very pro-Wall Street. The judge had been in the news at that point for being a part of a love triangle that was very publicized in the New York tabloids. So at this point, this judge is in a very fine mood. Not surprisingly, this judge basically gives Pepsi whatever they want. They want to have the case brought before a jury. The judge will not allow it. She'll make the decision. They want to depose Pepsi executives. She doesn't allow that. She says basically we have all the evidence we need. She then decides that she is going to decide the case on summary judgment. And what that means is basically, and this is a defense tactic in these bigger cases, basically the defense will argue that based on the facts and evidence, no reasonable person could possibly find in favor of the opposing party. The judge in the Southern District agrees with Pepsi. She writes this very kind of long 5-page decision where she grants their summary judgment motion and defeats John's lawsuit. The main kind of sticking point in this is her conclusion that Pepsi did not formally make an offer. So, under the law, advertisements are not really considered offers. It has to be very specific language for it to be an offer. Usually, also, offers have to be usually memorialized in writing.
I feel like nowadays, when they do contests and giveaways, they do refer to it as an offer, right?
They do, because a lot of times it's like, but again, it's usually memorialized in writing, in boilerplate language. What really kind of made this a case was the fact that there was no language that said, there was no boilerplate language. Like if you watch a commercial with a contest, you'll see there's like a whole, like almost like the whole bottom of the screen is language that's about this big.
All the fine print.
You can only win if you're between if you're between 5'8" and 5'9" on a Tuesday in July. And if you're 5'10", you're fucked. One of the things that comes from this is that this case almost now sets precedent. The executives in the Netflix documentary, and this is probably by design, the Pepsi executives come off as smarmy and very cocky. The one guy just keeps repeating, you have to be insane to think this was legitimate. It was clearly a joke and everyone found it funny. That same executive then tells a story that his son years later is in law school and his son is taking his contracts class, and he says, Dad, what do you know about Harrier jets? Because we just talked about it in law school. So it became almost not only precedent, but there's been now numerous legal scholars have weighed in on whether or not this was a viable contract. It's become almost a debate point in contracts classes for law schools about whether or not this was considered a contract.
And a teaching moment. The more you know.
I would have been really interested to see what a jury thought, because the whole basis of the judge's opinion was no reasonable person. And that's usually the standard when you're talking about whether it's a contract or not. It's not would anyone think, it's what a reasonable person of reasonable intellect and logic, just a reasonable person would think constitutes an offer or constitutes an obtainable, realistic offer. You can fall either way. Obviously, the documentary has John and his supporters say that it was an offer. And the Pepsi executives all say it wasn't. Now, very interestingly enough, the ad executives who came up with the ad, and by the way, this was an ad that, by their own admission, basically emptied their entire advertising budget for the year to shoot, admits that he would have been a horrible witness for Pepsi, because he would have had to say under oath that Pepsi, basically, that they had an ad that would have made it very clear that it was a joke, and Pepsi forced them to change it at their behest. It also would have said that Pepsi then basically reacted to it by putting out two other versions of the ad, one that changed it to 700 million Pepsi points, and one that changed it to 700 million Pepsi points with parentheses, just kidding, underneath it. And the irony is, and that the executive brings this up a couple times, if they had done that from the start, none of this would have happened.
Yeah.
And Laura, I kind of want to get your, and I know, like I said, I know I went through a lot of legal mumbo jumbo with this, but this was really kind of indicative of how desperate Pepsi was at times to try and get market share and, try to build their brand, so to speak. And they almost paid for it dearly. Very dearly. So I wanted to kind of get your opinion on, what did you think of the lawsuit? I mean, did you think it had any merit to it?
Well, I see both sides of it, but I get where this looks really ridiculous, and how I kind of agree that no reasonable person would think that this was attainable or achievable. Like it sounds super ridiculous. But I also understand the other side of it, where this wasn't clearly spelled out. And like I said, it was kind of like, okay, well, challenge accepted. And I don't think that Pepsi had, I guess, enough fine print behind it or strict rules or clarity in this that, would say this was a joke or this wasn't attainable. So I don't know. I kind of see both sides. I think at the end of the day, if you're looking at this legally, though, I mean, they didn't have the language behind it. So if I were that judge, and I think you're right, it came down to the fact that this judge was pro corporation and pro Wall Street. And if they weren't, I'd be interested to see what the outcome would have been.
What I will tell you is I really do wish it had gone to a jury because I would have been interested in what a jury would have thought about it.
Too, juries tend to favor more regular people over corporations and tend to be a little more lenient towards them. So I don't know, probably too, the sentiment back in the 90s was that it's definitely worse today.
I do think there was more of a lenient stance on corporations in the 90s. I think people had a more positive view of them. Because you have to remember, too, like when this is happening, this decision comes down, I think, in either 99 or 2000 when the decision is published. So at this point, MCI, WorldCom hadn't happened yet. Enron hadn't happened yet. Tyco hadn't happened yet. All of these kind of massive corporate frauds, these very public corporate frauds, hadn't occurred yet. The public sentiment toward corporations was not where it was before. They also talk about Pepsi originally wanting to move this case to New York because it was a more favorable venue for them. And I don't think that would have been the case in 2024. Also, juries can be unpredictable. You probably could have seen a hung jury where no one would have really been able to decide whether or not, this constituted a binding contract or not.
Yeah, that's where I'm stuck a little bit, but I still go back to it wasn't clear in the fine print and in the legal language.
When you see, if you go back and watch it, it's definitely an interesting watch. It's called Pepsi, Where's My Jet on Netflix. One of the things that his lawyers that Avenatti keep bringing up is when they show them the commercial and they keep asking them, play it back. And they keep looking, and they're looking and looking and looking for language that never shows up. I would have been interested to see what regular people would have thought about it. To be honest, I could see where that would give people pause. Because you're right. Literally, all they had to do was put just kidding or put 7 trillion points. That's literally all you would have had to do, and it would have become a very obvious joke. One of the things that, and I won't bore you all by going into the just absolute legal minutia of going through this judge's decision. There's actually a line in there that she says, well, it's clearly a joke because there's a child flying a Harrier jet into school when we all know this wouldn't happen.
It sounds like Pepsi underestimated its customers.
And that's why Avenatti had kind of tried to push this mindset of, Pepsi's done this before with bait and switches and of misleading promotions. There was something that one of the executives said, and he kindly, proudly said, once a cola warrior, always a cola warrior, which is just absurd statement to read out loud. But it also tells you basically how just single-minded and purpose all these executives were. It was not about thinking about any consequences. It was not about thinking about what could happen. It was all about just beating Coca-Cola. And I think they got tunnel vision. I think they underestimated. You're completely right. I think they underestimated their customer base.
Because there's always that one person that needs to go to the extreme, above and beyond. And again, if this wasn't explicitly spelled out, then that opened the door for this.
What really kind of exposed them to this as well was when you watch the documentary, John comes off as extremely likable. He's someone that would be cast in a commercial. He's like tall, just a kind of average looking kid, very personable, very likable. When he's doing all these media tours, he seems very, very believable. And he comes off as a sympathetic plaintiff. He doesn't come off as a kid just looking to squeeze this for money.
What happened to John after this? Do you know?
He just went on to live a normal life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as normal as he can be. This documentary kind of veers off in different directions. They talk about how him and Todd basically go and hike some of the tallest mountains in the world. That part of it is extremely interesting because they show video of them climbing Everest, video of them climbing the mountains in Antarctica. So in the in the middle of doing all of these things, they're suing Pepsi for a jet. When I was doing my research, I was watching this and reading the legal scholars just writing earnestly about a kid suing for a Harrier jet. There was a Simpsons episode about 30 years ago where the premise was that Bart wins a radio contest where he has a choice of either winning $10,000 or getting an elephant. And he basically wants the elephant, and he does everything he can before the station finally relents and gives him an elephant. It's one of the better episodes of the first 4 or 5 seasons. It really becomes a situation of kind of life imitating art because that episode actually airs about a year and a half before the Pepsi stuff ad comes out and John Leonard sues for his Harrier jet. Again, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction.
The jet was his elephant.
Reach for your elephant, kids. But I kind of want to know from you guys if you remember this. Because I'll be honest, I was maybe 8, 9, 10 years old at the time. I didn't. I remember the commercial, and I remembered Pepsi commercials that ran around that time. In fact, I remember watching the commercial. I didn't think about saving up enough points to buy a Harrier jet. I can tell you that part of that was we did not drink Pepsi in the house. We were a Coke family. First of all, Coke was not dumb enough to come out with Crystal Pepsi.
It was such a phenomenon back then, but it didn't last too long.
Because it was basically seltzer.
It wasn't like it was the only clear soda, because you had Sprite at that point, which was already clear. I didn't quite understand what they were going for, and it wasn't super successful anyway.
But like that was part of the clear beverage. Like I remember seeing the commercials for Zima. That was a very big thing.
Do you also remember Pepsi did the lemon twist and the lime twist, and Coke had vanilla Coke? I feel like they always try to reinvent themselves like every so often. Maybe not so much lately, but at least back then, yeah.
Well, I mean, now you can basically, like I said, go back to the Lewis Black joke. We've all drank enough Coke and Pepsi in our lifetime, we could piss it for a week. We drink so much soda as a country that these companies don't kind of have to be in battle with each other anymore.
Do you think after this trial and after this was adjudicated and, all was said and done, do you think that Coke got an advantage because of this, because of all like the bad press and how this went down? Like, did this impact Coke's sales in a positive way?
I couldn't find anything in my research that would say one way or the other. I have to think it maybe helped a little, because I think there were some people that probably did not like the way Pepsi handled themselves. Again, you're also starting to get into the early 2000s at this point, and kind of the public perception of corporations are starting to shift. It's starting to shift from corporations that are well liked to something you kind of just have to deal with on a daily basis. There is a sort of brand loyalty to Pepsi and Coke. Like if you're in a Pepsi household, you will probably never drink Coke. If you're in a Coke household, you'll probably never drink Pepsi.
I would agree with that. I think people are very much one side or the other. And I know we were talking in the beginning about like which one we preferred. And for me, honestly, like I said, I don't drink a lot of soda, if any at all. When I do have it, I go for Diet Coke. And it's like, it's not even a question. Like that's my go-to. And then, if I'm out somewhere and they have to substitute Diet Pepsi, it's like, oh, this is not the same. This is, but yeah, I totally get you. People are very loyal to one or the other.
And like in Atlanta, where Coke is made, I don't think anyone even drinks a Pepsi in Atlanta.
Well, I was going to say that too. Which one do you think is more popular today? Because in my experience, and this might just be a Northeast thing, I don't know, but at least the people in my life, family and friends, tend to go more towards Coke. I don't know a ton of people that really love Pepsi over Coke.
I found more Coke. Pepsi was a little bigger because Pepsi is from New York and they're bottled in New York. It was more even. Coke has so many just iconic parts of its brand where, again, you see the bottle, you see the script, and you know it's a Coke.
I always thought that too. I definitely think that Coke has more of that like old school vibe to it, where Pepsi I don't think has as much, I don't know, customer loyalty, customer attachment to it, just because the marketing campaigns were so different. And I think that's where Coke did a much better job at making it something that, I don't know, was more, I don't want to say relatable. I don't know if that's the right word. Yeah, I just think that Coke did a better job at marketing itself over the years.
I think the way you look at it as, Pepsi's had a bunch of iterations on its red, white, and blue swirling logo. Like they've changed it a bunch of times, just in our lifetime alone. They've changed the cans and everything like that. Coca-Cola has had the same script logo for generations. And again, it's easily recognizable. That's why Coke didn't really have to attract the type of big name celebrities that Pepsi did. Pepsi had to brand themselves as the young person's drink. They had to brand themselves as this is what, these are what the cool kids in the corner are drinking.
But honestly, I don't remember when I was younger that being a sentiment, at least in like real life. And they very well did push that. I do kind of remember it being like a younger, hipper thing. But I think in reality, when I was like teenager, early 20s, like that wasn't even a thought. Like that didn't play either way for me.
Well, and the other thing too is by that point, by the time you and I are in high school, we're only a couple years apart, they've moved away from that. One of the taglines was literally be young, have fun, drink Pepsi. It was one of those things that I think when you're in the bubble of like a Madison Avenue ad agency, you're trying to think about what is relatable to a 20-year-old kid. Again, what an ad executive thinks is cool and hip with a 20-year-old is not exactly what a 20-year-old's going to think is cool and hip.
Accurate.
I don't think the messaging drew people to Pepsi as much as probably more the celebrities they got to endorse Pepsi. No one's going to think Pepsi is cool because it's a hip drink. But if you can show Shaq and Cindy Crawford and in the 80s Michael Jackson drinking Pepsi, well, that's going to influence people a lot more than a bunch of good-looking people dancing at a rave drinking Pepsi.
That does move the needle a bit more, yeah.
Yeah, like in the late 90s for us, if you showed Britney Spears drinking a Pepsi or doing a Pepsi commercial, yeah, that's probably going to be more influential.
But again, to our point earlier, I feel like no matter what they did, and I remember seeing some of those commercials, it didn't sway me away from Coke at all. We leaned more Coke in our household as well, but it never, I don't know, at least for me, it never changed anything.
No, it didn't. The only time it did, Pepsi was the first one to do the 0 calorie. They had the 1 calorie Pepsi.
Pepsi One. I
Pepsi
remember
One
that.
in the
Yeah.
silver can. They were the first ones that did like the 0 calorie, 0 sugar soda that still tasted like the regular soda. And so that was big for me because I never liked Diet Coke. Diet Coke to me tastes bitter.
It's definitely an acquired taste, I feel like. But now, like, I can't go back. I can't drink a normal Coke because it's too sugary. And I definitely just don't like the taste of Pepsi. They're very distinctly different, in my opinion.
absolutely. So that was the only thing that switched for me. But then once Coke came out with their zero, I was right back to Coke. So it's an interesting debate.
Has Coke ever had any of these crazy lawsuits before or since then?
Not as publicized as this.
Okay.
When you think about Coke, Coke's advertising has never really been that off the wall.
But like I said, I think nostalgia is the word I was going for, and we use that word a lot on this podcast. But I think they kind of relied on that, and that worked for them. That formula worked for them.
It did. The song doesn't go, I like to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. I like to buy the world a Pepsi. Like I want to buy the world a Coke. Coke didn't need flash or pizzazz to sell their product. They had the substance.
I would have also loved to be an executive at Coke during this lawsuit. I'm sure that they were laughing their asses off over this shit.
Basically, imagine just any sort of Mad Men type of like scene. Just a bunch of guys in suits and cigars. The smoke pillowing from the cigar smoke pillowing from their mouths as they cackle openly, watching Pepsi getting scorched by a 20-year-old kid. We want to know, as always, what you guys think. Did you like Coke? Did you like Pepsi? Were you a weirdo that likes Mr. Pibb? We won't judge. Unless you like Mr. Pibb, then we'll judge you.
Or I have to shout out my sister-in-law. She loves Mountain Dew. That's pretty much her go-to in terms of soda, and which I never saw the appeal of Mountain Dew. But for all those Mountain Dew heads out there, shout out for you too.
Well, listen, unless you've had Mountain Dew Baja Blast, you haven't lived. So do you like Coke? Do you like Pepsi? Do you like Mr. Pibb? Do you drink Royal Crown Soda? Do you drink RC? One of the 5 people left who still drink RC. Let us know. Reach out to us at Instagram and TikTok at the Tell Me About Podcast. And reach out to us on Gmail at the Tell Me About Podcast at gmail.com. And let us know what you think. We want to hear from you. And we always want to take your feedback and integrate it into our episodes.
And definitely send us episode suggestions. We got a couple in that were really, really good. So we're going to incorporate those into future episodes. So that's our show. So we'll be back next week with another episode. I'm going to cover something that will be a bit topical at that point, and I'm ready to dig into that and kind of get both sides of that issue. So definitely tune in next week to hear that one. Have a good week, everybody.
Bye.